Rain didn't fall. It drilled the plaza, needling umbrellas, turning stone into a slick mirror of sirens and neon. Dr. Aisha Thompson moved through it without flinching. Blazer-soaked briefcase clamped at her side, eyes fixed on the bronze door. Officer Daniel Harper slid from the crowd, badge tilted, smile thin as a razor. "You don't belong in my courthouse," he announced, daring witnesses to nod. Aisha stopped, water sliding along her cheek like a line drawn with ice. "I have business inside," she said, calm enough to sound dangerous. The strike cracked across her face, sudden, ringing, sending her spinning. The briefcase popped, papers burst upward like startled gulls, then skittered down the steps, printing the rain with legal ink. Phones rose. A child gasped. A courier froze mid-stride. Harper spread his stance for the cameras. "Step back, subject is erratic," he barked, rehearsed authority masking fear. Aisha caught the rail, steadied, gathered 3 drenched pages, then stood tall, breath even. She looked past him to the granite marker by the entrance, where gold letters burned through water. "The Honorable Aisha R. Thompson Courthouse." A second of silence stretched like a wire. A bailiff at the door faltered, recognition flashing before he hit it. Aisha's fingers traced the bruise, then tightened around the handle. A blue evidence ribbon dangled from the briefcase's spine, stamped with a seal no patrolman should ignore. Thunder rolled. Somewhere above, security cameras winked red. She stepped forward, unhurried, unstoppable, leaving the scattered pages like breadcrumbs on the stone. Harper swallowed, performing certainty he no longer felt. The city held its breath, rain dimming to a whisper, as Aisha crossed beneath the archway with a gaze that said the real hearing hadn't started yet. What happened next will shock you. Her next move turned justice upside down. Stay to witness the first gavel. Department 3 smelled of wet coats and printer toner, a sour mix that clung to the wood paneling as people shuffled in from the storm. Fluorescent tubes ticked overhead, casting a flat yellow haze that softened no edges. A bailiff announced the case in a voice that carried no interest, and temporary authority took its place. Leonard Gray, visiting judge, settled behind the bench with careful ceremony, adjusting his robe as if fit alone could provide legitimacy. He peered over half-rimmed glasses at the docket, then at the man already standing at the lectern, Officer Daniel Harper, uniform immaculate, boots shining, posture trimmed to regulation, opened his mouth like a professional storyteller who knows the room belongs to him. He began with weather, crowd, safety concerns, then threaded in the stranger. According to his account, a woman in civilian clothes entered the plaza behaving erratically, voice rising, movements aggressive, clutching a briefcase that he suspected held stolen documents. He said he issued clear commands in a calm tone. He said she ignored them. He said she closed the distance suddenly, prompting a protective intervention. Each claim landed with practiced precision. He minimized his own force, framed every action as a reluctant necessity, and delivered the narrative in clean beats that left little space for doubt. Gray nodded along, pen tracing small ticks that looked like approval disguised as notes. The gallery breathed in slow, low way. The clerk recorded with admirable speed, though a faint crease marked her forehead whenever Harper borrowed legal vocabulary that did not suit him. Aisha sat at the defense table, wrists cuffed, the pink indentation of metal deepening against skin warmed by lamps. A bruise blossomed high on her cheekbone, purple threading through brown like a bruise drawn by a careful painter. She kept still. She watched everything. She counted the cameras, the domed lenses blooming from corners and beams. She noticed which light flickered near the exit, and which cable ran toward a cart draped in plastic. Her silence felt deliberate, not empty. Harper's voice filled the space instead, a metronome of confidence. He supplied printouts, partial stills, and a map of the steps outside with arrows pointing toward supposed zones of risk. He repeated that he feared a breach of restricted records. He repeated that she posed a threat to order. Gray nodded again. The room hummed with agreement that seemed older than any of them. The clerk glanced at Aisha, then away, then back again, as if verifying the discrepancy between the person in cuffs and the portrait being painted in neat, heavy strokes. Harper requested supporting testimony. Officer Carter arrived first, lean, careful, shoes whispering across the tile. He swore in and recited a sequence that matched Harper's outline so precisely, it felt memorized. He said he heard raised voices, saw quick motion, and perceived danger. He used the same labels: erratic, aggressive, stolen. He added a detail about the briefcase's weight, the way it pulled at her shoulder as though packed with contraband. He described Harper's restraint in the noble tones reserved for small heroics. Then came Officer Evans, broad frame, patient cadence, eyes that never left the bench. He corroborated everything with the steadiness of a church reading. He mentioned slippery steps, filming bystanders, and a rush of people seeking shelter from the rain. He echoed the malfunction, the unfortunate failure of technology at crucial moments. He praised policy compliance. He too concluded that quick action prevented harm. Their testimony felt choreographed, beats aligning like footsteps on parade. The crowd murmured, a tired sound of agreement mixed with boredom. One man smirked, another woman scribbled in a notebook, perhaps a freelancer, hungry for a neat headline. Gray asked measured questions that opened doors rather than walls. Did you perceive an immediate threat? Yes. Did you escalate force proportionally? Yes. Did you attempt de-escalation first? Absolutely. He stacked affirmations like bricks until a structure appeared where truth should have been. Aisha lowered her eyelids, not to hide but to listen harder. Chain links on her cuffs clicked. The bailiff shifted. The clerk's mouth pressed thin, then relaxed into neutrality, the mask that keeps a desk job safe. Air felt heavy, saturated with old procedure. The lighting, dim and unforgiving, bleached nuance from face. Harper returned to the lectern and summarized, a suspicious trespasser, potential theft, a refusal to comply, a necessary intervention. He gestured at the door as though danger still hovered near the threshold. He never once looked directly at Aisha. She studied his hand. She marked the ring finger where a barely visible callus suggested a habitual pen grip rather than streetwear. She tracked the microsecond glance he flicked toward Carter every time a timeline point came due. She logged how Evans breathed before repeating a phrase, as if catching the cue in the rhythm. She measured Gray's nods, the way they arrived before the final clause, like answers reaching early to meet favored questions. The clerk paused at last, pen hovering. A tiny frown appeared and Gray missed it. Harper did not. He accelerated. He described how the woman's papers flashed with official seals that he believed were counterfeit, although he admitted he had not verified with the records office yet due to urgency. He dropped a phrase about the chain of custody and another about exigent circumstances. He leaned on the podium until the wood creaked. A fluorescent tube flickered twice, then steadied. The gallery settled deeper into its benches, an audience lulled by cadence. Aisha angled her head to catch the reflection on the dark glass of a blank monitor near the wall. The screen showed nothing, yet she could see the red LED on the camera dome above the door steady as a heartbeat. She inhaled slowly, then let the breath slip away without sound. When Gray invited questions from the defense, no attorney rose. She had been denied counsel for the moment, under the pretext of scheduling. Silence followed like a curtain. Gray began to speak, ready to adopt Harper's account as provisional truth, when a printer coughed up a forgotten page on the clerk's station. The clerk startled, smoothed the sheet and tucked it beneath a folder, but not before her eyes cut briefly to Aisha's face, with something almost like an apology. That look lived in the seam between routine and conscience. It told the careful observer that the record would not align cleanly with the performance. Gray cleared his throat, prepared a summary about public safety, and requested any additional exhibit. Harper held up the incident sheet again, lamented the camera problem one more time, then asked that the briefcase be impounded immediately for authentication, and that the court maintain custody of the defendant until verification. He framed those steps as ordinary, even protective. The bailiff, whose name tag read Jenkins, avoided Aisha's eyes. He failed, recognition flickered, then hid, then flickered again. Aisha did not move. She rotated a cuffed wrist a fraction to restore circulation, and the gleam of steel caught the clerk's attention. The crowd kept murmuring, damp coats releasing that woolly smell that makes rooms feel smaller. Gray looked satisfied, ready to rubber stamp the ask. Yet the narrative did not quite hold. Aisha's calm posture, the meticulous arc of her focus, the briefcase itself, heavy, scuffed at the corners, tagged with a blue evidence ribbon, suggested a story at odds with the label trespasser. The clerk noticed. One spectator noticed. Jenkins noted. Their eyes did not change the outcome. Not yet, but they challenged the weight of Harper's polish. The judge lifted his gavel a fraction, then lowered it without sound, and the room waited. Outside, rain chased itself down windows. Inside, bias marched in orderly lines, trained by years of repetition. Harper stood tall, shining, and believed the afternoon had already been decided. Aisha breathed, observed, and waited for the right hinge to turn. Thunder rolled beyond the windows while Department 3 settled into a hush that felt rehearsed. Officer Daniel Harper lifted a plastic sleeve, tapping the lectern as though conducting the room, and announced that he possessed video from the courtyard, regrettably compromised by a sudden malfunction. He said his body camera had frozen at the worst instant, Frames garbled, audio clipped, timestamps jumping like a scratched disc, rain pattered on glass, tiny sticks on a snare, keeping time with his explanation. Harper fed a flash drive into the cart and pressed play. The monitor showed umbrellas, a wet stone, a briefcase, and a uniform moving into the frame. The image stuttered, smeared, halted at a moment that should have told everything, then lurched ahead 8 seconds. He sighed, calculating helplessness with a practiced smile, and declared the court must accept sworn accounts. The clerk typed quickly, yet a faint crease marked her brow whenever the timeline skipped. Aisha watched. Handcuffs bit her wrists. A bruise shadowed her cheek. She did not lower her eyes. She counted camera domes, noted the coil of cable, and traced the patch cord draped over a power strip. Harper advanced to a second file captured by a lobby lens. Again, the crucial instant blurred into noise, then recovery. He called the failure unfortunate, the weather merciless, the storage network fragile, and the staff overworked. Gray nodded at each adjective like a metronome marking beats. The gallery rustled, half convinced already, half bored. Aisha raised her head and asked to address preservation and access. Gray, the guarding authority, allowed a brief statement. Her voice arrived steady, low, exact. She cited the state public records statute, the municipal ordinance requiring retention, and federal cases establishing obligations when exculpatory material may exist. Brady, Gillio, Kiles. She requested immediate duplication by neutral staff, sealed, logged, and available for inspection. She specified the plaza, lobby, corridor, stairwell, and west entrance. Every lens feeding the system. She added that body cameras run rolling buffers even during declared failures, and that auxiliary microphones often pick up hallway audio. She asked that any vendor mirrors or cloud caches attached to courthouse security be preserved. The words sounded less like an argument than a protocol recited correctly. A murmur traveled across the benches. Reporters leaned forward. Jenkins, the bailiff, blinked and stared at the cart as if something there had called his name. Harper smiled thinly and dismissed her citations as theory detached from rain and chaos. He said storms scramble packets, clocks desynchronize, cables sweat beneath tape. Aisha replied that storms rarely choose the precise instant that test power. She asked the clerk to confirm the retention cycle. The clerk, cheeks warming, answered that footage remains available for a rolling month, unless an order says otherwise. Harper said maintenance forced an early reset last night. The clerk checked a ledger and quietly corrected him. Next week. Silence pressed inward, soft yet heavy. Outside, water softened its beat, the kind of hush that follows a truth people are not ready to name. Aisha turned toward the benches, not pleading, simply marking the moment. Have you ever felt silenced by a system stacked against you? Aisha's next words changed everything. She faced the bench again and asked for a written preservation order. Before the hour ended, she pointed at the monitor, at an overlay clock drifting from the wall clock visible in the frame, evidence that the feed had been cut and stitched. She mentioned the reflection along the glass panel by the doors, a bright sliver showing a clear angle of contact, and another reflection on the wet handrail, 5 steps down. She described the patch cable hanging loose over a power strip when it should have been locked into the rack. Gray's eyes sharpened despite himself. He asked Harper why a quadrant near the handrail had been masked. Harper said the panel suffered water damage that produced a strobe effect. The screen held steady, without strobe. Evans shifted, boots squeaking. Carter ran a thumb along a seam. Jenkins stepped to the cart at Aisha's request and lifted the flap on the rear connections. He reseated a loose HDMI, tightened a threaded Coca zaptor, and restarted playback. A hiss bled away. Audio returned as a thin line. Rain, footsteps, a breath taken too quickly. The missing 8 seconds surfaced, no longer swallowed by static. On screen, Aisha stood still while Harper closed the distance. His mouth moved. The recovered channel rendered the insult through distortion, without erasing meaning. The room inhaled. Then the hand rose. Contact followed, and pages flew. Harper stabbed the stop key and warned that the court risked contamination without an evidentiary hearing. Gray did not answer immediately. The clerk's pen skated across a pad, the hollow sound of paper catching the room's attention, more than the judge's cough ever had. Aisha said the footage already sat within court custody and required only copying under seal, not fit. She requested that Jenkins continue duplication to a portable drive now with checksums printed and signed. Jenkins nodded and began. Reporters whispered, Someone near the back shut a dripping umbrella, slow, ceremony. Harper tried to rebuild the wall by invoking discretion, commendations, community awards and policy language that permits measured force during volatile encounters. Aisha asked whether he documented any verbal warning prior to contact. He said yes. She asked where the words appeared in the report. He gestured vaguely. She observed that the lines reserved for quotations sat blank. He claimed digital smearing during upload. The clerk produced the paper original. The lines were still blank. Evans stared at the floor. Carter's jaw slid sideways, then settled. Gray rubbed his temple and asked why the camera error appeared at precisely the same segment across two separate feeds. Harper answered that lightning causes synchronized blips. Aisha noted that the building's surge logs show no interruption at the relevant time. Jenkins confirmed from a panel by the door. The room listened the way a body listens for the next heartbeat when it has skipped one already. Outside, rain tapered to a fine thread against glass. Aisha's confidence grew without volume. She addressed the clerk by name, asked that the docket reflect the exact time, and requested issuance of a standing order extending preservation to any off-site mirror managed by the vendor. She suggested appointing a neutral technician before the close of business. Gray hesitated, pride wrestling with prudence, then agreed. He signed the order and told Jenkins to escort all copied media to a secure cabinet. Harper kept smiling, but the expression no longer fit his eyes. He requested a recess. Gray denied it. Aisha lifted her chin. The bruise did not define her. It marked a crossing. She asked one final question, whether any warning appeared on the audio track. The recovered channel carried only the insult and the command he issued afterward to cast her as a rat. The gallery heard the sequence and understood its meaning without prompting. Gray folded his hands, gaze fixed on the frozen frame of wet steps and scattered pages. The system that had nodded along a moment earlier paused, listening to its. Aisha thanked the court for honoring preservation obligations and sat. No flourish, no drama, only the certainty of process, finally taking root. The rain thinned to lace outside. Inside, a different weather began. The quiet pressure that precedes a break in the sky. The kind that makes people hold their breath and keep watching, waiting. Rain clung to the courthouse windows and unbroken lines. A steady percussion that made the panes feel alive while Department 3 settled into a damp hush. Fluorescent tubes hummed above dark wood. The benches answered every shift with long creaks that sounded like old doors thinking twice. Judge Leonard Gray rested behind the bench, pen balanced, face arranged into impartial calm. At the lectern, Officer Daniel Harper held himself at attention. Uniform work to a shine, voice warmed to a confident pitch by hours of practice. He looked certain. He sounded like policy. He raised a plastic sleeve as if it were a shield and said the machines had done their worst. He advanced the courtyard feed. Umbrellas jittered across the frame. Rain stitched diagonal lines, and at the critical second, the picture fractured into gray blocks before leaping forward 8 counts. Harper sighed. The sound of a professional who knows machines fail at the worst time. He claimed his body camera froze simultaneously, offered the lobby clip as backup, and pressed play on a second stutter that skipped the same moment. He spread his hands toward fate and weather. The clerk typed on, but a small crease formed between her brows. Repetition with perfect timing is not weather. It is editing by another name. The benches groaned as people leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Aisha rose as far as the cuffs allowed and asked the court to enter an immediate preservation order. Her list arrived without hurry. Plaza, lobby, west corridor, south stairwell, mezzanine, entrance arches, auxiliary lenses, body cam rolling buffers, hallway microphones, vendor mirror, cloud overflow. She cited Brady Vowles of Maryland first, then Gillio and Kyle's Whitley, and the public records statute with its retention clause. She requested duplication to sealed drives with printed checksums, signatures from the bailiff, clerk, and a neutral technician, plus extension of retention beyond the usual cycle. Her tone stayed even, her cadence steady, her language precise enough to feel like instructions the room had been waiting to follow. Harper laughed softly without sound. He told Gray that storms scramble packets, overlays drift, cables sweat under tape, and indoor cameras inherit outdoor tantrums through wiring older than the stair rails. He recommended reliance on sworn accounts rather than fickle sense. Aisha nodded once, then pointed at the overlay clock and the wall clock captured in the door's glass. The times disagreed in a manner that implied cuts, not clouds. She noted a patch cable hanging loose over a power strip that should have been locked inside the rack. She asked why two different lenses lost breath in the same 8 seconds. She asked the clerk how long the system's retention ran. 30 days, came the answer. The crease deepened. Bailiff Jenkins stepped to the cart at her request. His badge said Jenkins, but recognition moved behind his eyes, quick and unguarded, before he hit it under duty. He had seen her elsewhere in a context that made her posture straighten by instinct. He reseated the HDMI, tightened the Coke sleeve, checked the rack's sync LED, and aligned the overlay to the wall clock. The smear along the critical second acquired edges. The frozen moment revealed the beginning of a raised hand where noise had lived. The benches let out a collective, reluctant creak. Harper's stare went from confident to careful, the way a performer looks when a stage light shifts off script. Gray denied Harper's call for a recess and instructed Jenkins to begin duplication now. The clerk's pen slowed and steadied, small adjustments that felt like a new tempo taking hold. Aisha repeated her request with added scope. Write-ahead buffers from the recorder, vendor access logs, off-site mirrors configured for overflow, and the network time records for the hour in question. She asked for a neutral technician to sign the envelope, along with the bailiff and the clerk. She requested that both sides receive copies. The court retained the originals under seal, and the cabinet log each access with time, name, and reason. Procedure marched in, not loud but undeniable. Harper pivoted to biography, commendations, years of service, toy drives, neighborhood watches, mentorship breakfasts, wallet returns, kindnesses that sound like absolution when spoken quickly. The room wanted to accept the montage because accepting montages is easier than admitting a pattern. Aisha did not contest any good deed. She returned to the report, where she asked, was the quoted warning required by policy before contact? He pointed to a section with blank lines. Upload error, he said. The clerk produced the paper original. The lines remained empty. Evans shifted his weight. Carter studied the floor. Gray cleared his throat, but the sound did not fill the room anymore. Rain eased from drum to curtain. Drops drew slow paths down the glass, turning the city into watercolors. The cart replayed the plaza in real time. Audio rose as a thin band. Through his hiss, a sentence emerged with enough shape to cut. A command followed, crafted for later paperwork. And then the strike, clear as a bell tapped for tone. Phones stayed down. No one needed a second angle to understand the sequence. Gray adjusted his glasses and looked at Harper fully for the first time. The reflex of belief interrupted. The benches answered with a held breath that made the building's old woods seem awake. Ever wonder what it takes to stand up when no one believes you? Aisha was about to show that. The words did not arrive as a slogan. They sounded like a truth that finally found its hour. She asked Jenkins whether the rack logged credentialed access during the stutter. He answered yes, entries include user tags even when footage is flagged for maintenance. She requested a printed log and a temporary hold on any account capable of deletions. Harper objected that the inquiry exceeded its scope. She replied that preservation without audit is an invitation to loss dressed as repair. Gray hesitated, then nodded once. Jenkins moved. Jenkins labeled the first drive, sealed it, noted the minute in block numbers, and slid it into a cabinet that clicked with polite finality. He printed the access log, handed it to the clerk, and returned to the cart with a steadiness that looked like choice. The clerk read the top lines, swallowed, then tucked the sheet beneath her ledger. Reporters loosen their shoulders the way people do when a story starts writing itself. Overhead, a camera's small red eye watched everything with tireless patience. A witness that did not need to swear an oath because it never forgot. Harper tried one last bridge. He warned against allowing defendants to commandeer security infrastructure or drag a court through technical minutiae. Aisha answered that a court does not surrender authority when it preserves its own senses. She quoted the ordinance guaranteeing public access to non-confidential recordings, and the administrative rule that mandates a written explanation for every outage with cause and duration. She asked for a status check before the close of business to confirm copies, locks, chain of custody signatures, and the scheduling of a neutral expert. Her voice did not rise, her certainty did. The room changed by inches rather than spect. The confidence that had marched in stiff lines began to falter at corners. The clerk's crease became a duty instead of a secret. Jenkins stood near the cart like a witness rather than scenery. The benches quieted, the creaks replaced by held breath, as if the wood itself did not want to miss the next sentence. Harper stared at the fixed frame of wet stone and blown papers, willing it back into blur. Aisha sat without lowering her gaze. Rain whispered against the windows, a fine veil over stone. The building listened, and the spark she struck began to glow for everyone. Department 3 waited in a held breath while the cart finished duplication, and Jenkins sealed the first drive with a strip of tape that snapped like a tidy verdict. Rain no longer hammered the windows. It traced thin silver cords that softened the city into pewter. Judge Leonard Gray leaned toward the microphone, ready to nest the afternoon inside measured language. Aisha stood before he spoke. The cuffs flashed under the fluorescence. The bruise on her cheek sat high and purple, but her posture carried the quiet steadiness of someone who knows the room better than the room knows itself. She lifted her chin and asked that restraints be removed pending verification. Jenkins hesitated for one beat, then stepped forward, keys clinking lightly, and released the chain. The sound ran through the benches and rail like a pin dropped into a deep well. Aisha opened her briefcase with deliberate care, drew out a leather wallet, flipped it and presented an embossed credential behind clear film. The signature matched the name that had hovered over every whisper since the plaza. She held it high enough for the bench, the clerk, the gallery, and the camera that never blinked. "I am Judge Aisha Thompson, presiding judge of this courthouse," she said. The words crossed wood, air, and cloth with the clean carry of a bell. They did not aspire. They confirmed. Gray's hand fell away from the microphone. The clerk rose without quite knowing why. Pen lifted from paper. Jenkins straightened instinctively. Reporters froze in the precise pose of people who understand that a moment has trapped them inside its clarity. Harper stared first at the credential, then at the plaque outside the door whose letters he had ignored through rain, then at the frozen frame on the monitor that caught his raised hand and her scattered documents. He opened his mouth and produced a sound like a hinge. Color drained. Knees buckled. He collapsed against the rail and slid to the tile, slow and graceless. A man released from the story he had rehearsed. Someone gasped. Jenkins moved quickly, calling for the medic, cushioning Harper's head with a folded blazer, checking pulse, clearing space with a practiced palm. Gray reached for the gavel and changed his mind, as if even a modest strike might shatter what order remained. Aisha did not rush. She kept the credential raised long enough for doubt to die, then closed the wallet and set it on the briefcase like a seal. She thanked Gray for maintaining basic order and asked the clerk to enter her appearance. Her tone respected the role without ceding 1 inch of authority. She requested permission to assume the bench immediately, citing continuity provisions in her assignment for the term. Gray nodded, still pale, and signaled assent. Jenkins retrieved a garment bag from a cabinet near the robing room door. Aisha unzipped it, drew out the robes cut plain and enduring, and settled the weight across her shoulders. Fabric whispered. A hook fastened at her collar with a soft click that sounded louder than thunder had all afternoon. Nothing theatrical followed, yet the room changed density. "Have you ever seen Justice flip the script?" Aisha's next move sealed his fate. The thought passed through the gallery like a current, gentle and undeniable. Rain slackened. Light broke across the upper windows and drew pale ladders through dust that had slept for years. Benches creaked in a language older than the code, a kind of wooden gratitude. Aisha stepped behind the bench and took the seat that already knew the shape of her shoulders. She adjusted the microphone and placed both hands on the wood in a balanced, open posture that became the room's spine. Calm power replaced performance. Even the fluorescents seemed to stop their restless hum. She began with the map of the next steps. The clerk would file the preservation order, extend retention to vendor mirrors, print the access log, and schedule a neutral technician within the hour. Jenkins would complete duplication to additional drives, verify checksums, seal envelopes, and update the cabinet log with time, name, and purpose. The technician would keep the courtyard frame on screen while pulling the lobby feed for synchronized review. A marshal would notify court administration that the presiding judge had assumed the bench for the matter now before the court. The cadence was not theatrical. It was infrastructure speaking. Harper stirred and tried to see. Jenkins steadied him while the medic checked pupil response and placed a cold pack in his hand. Indignation tried to climb across Harper's face and failed to find purchase. He looked at the robe with a kind of wary awe. He looked at the monitor and heard his own insult crawl back across the audio band with clinical indifference. He closed his eyes, his hands opened atop his knees as if waiting for instructions that no longer belonged to him. Aisha regarded him without malice, because malice would have granted him a drama he had not earned. She addressed the record. She noted the recovered segment, the absence of any quoted warning, the synchronized stutter across independent lenses, the incorrect maintenance claim, and the access entries preserved under seal. She affirmed that the court would honor public access and would enforce chain of custody rules to the letter. She spoke of obligations owed to truth, not to reputation. Her voice never rose. It deepened the room by making it honest. Gray stepped back from the microphone, file balanced in his hands, wearing the expression of a person who has watched storms and has finally seen clear air arrive. The clerk wrote faster, lines somehow neater than before. Reporters stopped hunting for faces and started writing names, times, and steps. The gallery became still in a way that felt chosen rather than imposed. Aisha lifted the gavel, weighed it, and set it down without sound. Silence traveled farther because it now came from strength rather than fear. Light grew. Plaques along the walls shed their dimness and displayed letters with crisp edges. Rain ticked faintly like a metronome kept for rhythm, not command. Aisha announced a short recess to allow the medic to complete an evaluation and the clerk to produce certified copies of the orders. She added that upon return, the court would review synchronized playback, sworn reports, and relevant policy, after which findings would issue. She asked Jenkins to stand watch over the evidence cabinet and the rest. He took a position by the cart, posture settled, eyes steady, bearing changed from neutral weight to protective presence. Gray stepped to the side and inclined his head. The clerk exhaled. A spectator in a damp hoodie brushed water from his sleeves and set his phone face down as if a private promise had been made. Aisha left for the robing room and returned in less than a minute with the same composed gait, robe falling clean, shoulders square. She looked not like triumph but like a standard finally installed at the correct height. She resumed the bench. The sun pushed through a widening seam in the cloud cover and laid pale gold across the floor in long bars. Those lines of light touched tile, rail, and faces, marking a kind of secular benediction. No one mistook the moment for spectacle. It felt like alignment. Aisha reviewed the calendar in a quick glance, and then the faces in front of her steady, unhurried, assessing without cruelty or heat. When she spoke, the room leaned in because it already trusted what would follow. This court, she said, would account for every second and every claim. This court would hold every witness to the same measure. This court would correct its own record where it had bent under pressure. The words carried no flourish, yet they sounded like a door unlocking. Harper bowed his head. Jenkins kept watch. Gray listened with something that resembled relief. The clerk's pen moved in clean strokes that mapped a different kind of day. Light gathered in quiet planes along the rail and across the seal above the bench, unmistakable, as if the building itself recognized the rightful occupant and settled its frame to match her breathing. The people who had arrived damp and doubtful sat straighter, not to please anyone but because clarity untangles posture. They understood that procedure had a pulse again, and that the next chapter would carry weight. Aisha looked at the cabinet, then at the monitor, then at the people who had come in from the storm expecting repetition and finding change. She gave a single nod, not to end anything, but to begin the next necessary act. The courthouse received the signal like a body accepting steady breath after panic. The room held still, aligned to the person now on the bench, and understood who would decide what happened next. The room held a steadier hush when Aisha resumed the bench. Robes settled, hands composed on the wood. She addressed Officer Daniel Harper by name and recited the elements of his account in the exact order he had used. An unidentified woman behaving erratically, an aggressive advance, a briefcase suspected of holding stolen records, a camera failure during critical seconds, and a reluctant intervention on rain-slick steps. She asked the clerk to read back his phrases. The clerk complied, voice even, drawing quotation marks through the air. Aisha turned to the screen. Jenkins stood ready at the cart. Play the scene and feeds, she said. The plaza appeared from two angles, then a third corridor lens spliced for timing. Rain-stitched silver diagonals across stone. Umbrellas bobbed. A uniform moved into frame. A woman in a dark blazer stopped where the granite seam met the bottom tread. Ahead to timecode 13, then half speed. The motion became a study. Harper closed the distance with shoulders squared and chin tilted toward authority. The woman's stance stayed neutral. One foot turned slightly outward, briefcase along her thigh. Audio up, Aisha said. A hiss resolved into breath. Footsteps, water, and a sentence soaked in contempt that needed no repetition. The record would capture every syllable. A command followed, crafted for later paperwork. Then his open palms struck with certainty that expected no consequence. Pages burst, spinning before sliding along the wet tread. Gasps scattered through the gallery. A phone lowered. The clerk's pen paused. Judge Gray's mouth compressed as if tasting metal. Advance 2 seconds, Aisha said. Harper pivoted, widened his stance and announced that the subject was erratic and aggressive. The frame showed calm hands lifting a page from stone, while another sheet skated beneath the rail. Aisha let the moment breathe. Then she spoke, tones steady, vowels clipped by training rather than anger. Officer Harper, point to the instant in which the person you restrained advanced on you with threatening intent. He stared at the image and said the movement occurred outside the lens. She remained on the lower step throughout your approach, Aisha answered. Note the tread edge below her heel. She asked Jenkins to freeze the overlay clock beside the wall clock, mirrored in the door glass. The seconds matched. Drift died there. Clerk, pull the incident report, she said. Read the lines reserved for any quoted warning. Silence filled the space where text should have lived. Aisha faced him again. You testified that a warning preceded contact. The paperwork holds none. The plaza feed lost the crucial instant. The lobby feed lost the same instant. Maintenance logs contradict your outage claim. Your partners repeated your phrasing in lockstep. The cabinet holds sealed copies under a chain of custody. We will rely on what machines capture. Benches creaked as people shifted to absorb sequence rather than fragments. Outside, rain softened from drum to curtain. Light gathered in the high windows. Run the hallway mic, Aisha. A thin band carried small sounds that weigh more than speeches. A breath pulled through teeth. A soul scraping wet stone. A word no corridor forgives. The slur echoed with clinical clarity. Recorded for the transcript, not for theater. Color rose along Gray's cheeks. He adjusted papers that did not need straightening. Aisha summarized without heat. The footage shows an unprovoked strike. The audio records the language you deny. The frames show a citizen holding position, while a sworn officer closes the distance, initiates contact, and then labels the restraint as an order. Your account is unsupported. Harper worked his jaw and spoke of pressure, noise, rain, bystanders, and professional caution. A warning is a warning only if it exists. Aisha replied. Procedure remains procedure in storms. She asked the clerk to display the access log Jenkins had printed. Highlight entries at 1423. 2 identifiers appeared, one for security, one mapped to a terminal used by evidence technicians. Both touched the stream minutes after the event. Jenkins confirmed on oath that the notes called it maintenance. Yet no outage alert had been filed. The court will issue an order preserving those accounts for audit, Aisha said. She returned to the image. Freeze the first frame of contact. A hand rose toward a cheek. Pages lifted into the rain. A jaw set around shock rather than threat. A reporter's pencil snapped. Gray blinked and resumed a posture he had practiced for decades, though it now rang hollow. Aisha's cadence tightened. You testified that you feared a breach involving stolen documents. Look at the blue ribbon on the briefcase handle. That tab denotes sealed evidence for official transport. Suspicion collapses on sight. He tried a narrower lane, claiming markings can be faked. She asked whether he verified with the records office before seizing property. He admitted he had not. She asked whether he documented any attempt to de-escalate beyond the unwritten law. He said he spoke calmly. The hallway audio, now louder, held only insult, command, and impact. Thunder rolled faintly beyond the glass. More memory than weather. Inside, the room's weight shifted from authority built on habit to authority grounded in proof. Aisha steadied her voice further. Iron under velvet. Here's what the court finds probable at this stage. You struck a woman who posed no immediate threat. You then gave a false narrative under oath. You tried to use a badge to convert aggression into procedure. She paused, not for effect, but to let the transcript keep pace. Charges are as follows. Assault under color of law, perjury for statements made on this record, and violations of civil rights guaranteed by statute and constitution. The words hung, clean as chimes. Jenkins shifted beside the cart with the bearing of someone now guarding more than a cabinet. The clerk wrote in careful strokes. Lines straight. Dates exact. Harper lifted his head as if to object, then swallowed. A vein pulsed at his temple. He looked toward Gray for rescue and found only a man who had watched a mirror for years, and finally saw a reflection he could not excuse. Embarrassment washed across the judge's face, not at losing control but at recognition of control ceded to ritual. Aisha continued. She cited policy sections requiring contemporaneous quotations for any commands preceding force. She quoted the ordinance mandating retention and the rule establishing the chain of custody. She listed steps already completed: duplication, sealing, checksums, log entries, and neutral review. Each sentence tightened the frame. The synchronized feeds ran in real time, uncut. The insult returned through speakers, stripped of mystique by its own ugliness. The strike arrived. The briefcase opened. Rain carried ink in arcs across stone. The camera stayed unblinking while Harper turned to perform control for a crowd that had watched what he denied. A woman near the aisle pressed a hand to her throat. A man in a damp hoodie looked at the floor. Reporters wrote particulars instead of adjectives. Benches creaked once, and then went still. Aisha's tone never leaned toward triumph. She sounded like duty-given breath. "You wore authority," she said, "and used it against truth. This court will not." She ordered him to place his service weapon on the rail and step back while Internal Affairs notified command. Jenkins moved with gentle precision, received the holstered sidearm, logged it, and returned without show. Aisha set the schedule. Statements under oath from Carter and Evans. After viewing synchronized footage. A hearing on tampering risks related to those access entries. A referral to the federal office regarding civil rights counts. Notice to the public liaison that recordings would be available consistent with the law. She faced the gallery and let silence work. "What matters in this building is not habit," she said. "What matters is the record." Outside, the storm loosened its grip. Lights slipped across plaques and rails. Inside, the crescendo did not sound like noise. It felt like clarity arriving. Harper sat because there was nowhere left to stand. Aisha lifted the gavel and let it hover, then set it down without a strike. Authority did not require punctuation. The court understood the sentence anyway. Rain intensified against the windows as Aisha signaled Jenkins to wheel the monitor forward and dim the humming lights. She kept her tone measured, but the gallery leaned in because structure had replaced spectacle. "We will review Officer Daniel Harper's 15 years, she said, from entries that do not forget. The clerk set a tabbed binder on the rail. Color flags marked complaints, stops, forced discipline, and settlements. The screen woke to a dashboard stamped with the department seal. A timeline ran across the top, bars rising and falling with each year. A thin line traced internal outcomes. Aisha let the picture hold before she read the numbers that closed the door on doubt. 50 complaints, she said. 40% involve people of color, 80% eights, sustained, 2 suspensions, 0 terminations. 22 marked not sustained after witnesses withdrew. Reporters no longer searched faces. They copied figures with practiced hunger. Judge Gray rubbed the bridge of his nose, embarrassment settling in where earlier nods had lived. Harper stared at the tabletop, pulse cording his neck. Carter folded his arms. Evans's boots squeaked and then went still. A heat grid replaced the timeline. Blocks glowed yellow and red over transit hubs, housing towers, and 2 commercial corridors where pedestrian stops have been contested for a decade. Arrest patterns, Aisha said, peaks on late swing and night tours. Hit rate for contraband, 9%. Searches without contraband, 71%. A legend explained itself. Small squares confessing in quiet colors. Aisha pointed to a bar labeled resisting that curled upward each summer. Stacking, she said. Charge added when original grounds collapsed. She advanced the internal findings line. It climbed beside that bar like a shadow. Correlation rarely lies. She turned the binder page and read from the settlement ledger. Total civil payouts, $2 million. Most between years 5 and 12. Notes, non-disclosure agreements. No admissions, sealed depositions, reprimands deferred, overtime unchanged. A pencil snapped along the press row. The sound cut cleanly through the hush. The clerk kept writing, lines straight. Jenkins stood at ease, eyes on the log, posture announcing that the cabinet's contents had a guard who understood both weight and history. The next panel lists stops by race, age, and census tract. Disparity index, Aisha said, stops per 1,000 residents. Even when time of day exposure is controlled, people of color are stopped at more than twice the rate of white residents in these tracts. She tapped a column where the index crossed 2. Gray did not look away. He seemed to recognize a chapter title being written in his own build. On screen, red markers tagged buffer drop and sync lost, clustered around force incidents. Body camera failure codes, Aisha said, most frequent when the lens would show cause. Vendor logs do not match narrative. The courthouse feeds you saw today are not an exception. They are a pattern. She read internal affairs phrases that repeated like a stamp. Discourtesy, unlawful search, excessive force, outcomes recycled, coaching, retraining, exoneration, not sustained. Credibility cannot print its own currency. Harper shifted, then stilled. Rain struck glass harder. Static gathering resolve. A chart labeled productivity metrics appeared. Proactive contacts per shift. Arrests per 100 contacts. Time to disposition, and overtime attached to court. The overtime curve rose with low-level arrests and fell when dismissals spiked. Dotted holidays climbed like kites on paid wind. This is incentive architecture, Aisha said. Bodies converted to numbers and numbers to praise. She displayed anonymized deposition quote. A teenager described a sidewalk search that ended as an obstruction. A grandmother said she was boarded on a hood while groceries bled water into the curb. A nurse in scrubs said a stop made her late for the shift, then later still because she filed a complaint that disappeared. Names were sealed. The language weighed enough without them. 50 complaints, she repeated, letting the count settle. 8 sustained. 40% never reached hearing because complainants withdrew after interviews, noting credibility concerns that mirror boilerplate. 20% settled without testimony. $2 million paid by taxpayers, none taken from his paycheck. The benches groaned, Wood acknowledging arithmetic. A scatter plot bloomed. Each dot a stop, color for race, shape for outcome, size for force. A line showed arrest probability after discretionary stops. For white subjects, the line hovered low even with searches. For black and brown subjects, it climbed steeply while contraband remained scarce. Aisha let the slope hold the room. Bias hides inside metrics until you pull it into the light. She produced an early warning memo from year 8. Thresholds exceeded on complaints. 3/4 involving force. Recommendation, closer supervision, training refresh, rotation. A stamped note undercut it. Deferred due to staffing. Another review 2 years later crossed the same thresholds and earned the same deferral and the same ink. Jenkins set a printed chart on an easel. Allegations per year beside community commendations. Parade duty, coat drives, mentorship leagues. 2 columns rose together, generous to the eye, confusing to the conscience. Community work matters, Aisha said, respectful and firm. Public kindness cannot launder private harm. Rain thickened, drumming with a steadier hand. Aisha cited policy requiring supervisors to audit random camera footage weekly and log findings. The audit column for Harper's unit showed gaps like missing teeth, sign off, gap, sign off, with no note. Every gap is a place where a story like today's can grow. Reporters wrote until their wrists cramped. One turned a page and wrote system at the top, as if naming the weather inside the walls. She asked Carter and Evans when they last received training on bias, de-escalation, and constitutional standards. Both offered the same old day. She asked whether supervisors had reviewed their footage last quarter. Evans started to nod, stopped, and admitted uncertainty. Carter watched the rail as if Grain could answer for him. Gray's embarrassment deepened. No longer about spectacle, but about oversight surrendered to routine. Aisha returned to the ledger and read amounts aloud, not to humiliate, but to quantify loss. Hospital bills, therapy, missed wages, legal fees, hours spent in rooms like this one. She closed the binder. 2 million cannot repair trust, she said, but it measures the size of our denial. The gallery did not whisper. Even the lights seemed to lower their rhythm out of respect. She placed both hands on the bench and drew a clear line from man to mechanism. This court will forward these findings to internal affairs, the Inspector General and the federal office. We will order an audit of footage, access logs, and supervisory compliance. We will require training schedules, evaluation forms, and proof of completion. We will ask the department to produce metrics, stripped of incentives, that reward volume over accuracy. We will not forget the people whose names stay sealed because fear purchased their silence. Aisha advanced one final slide. It overlaid complaint counts with neighborhood demographics and patrol assignments. The red clustered where resources were thin and patience was thin. A badge is supposed to arrive as help, she said. In these sectors, it arrived as a hazard. She allowed the silence to widen until even Harper seemed to hear what the data announced. Patterns like these are not weather, They are choices. She reminded the room that public access laws cover non-confidential recordings and that the preservation orders signed today would keep every frame. The footage you saw was not luck, she said. It was an honest machine finally allowed to speak. Rain hammered harder, a stern applause that belonged to weather, not people. The clerk finished a page, tore off the copy and slid it into a folder stamped with today's date. You are not the first officer to trust that frames would fail and reports would carry you through, Aisha said to Harper. That confidence ends today. She turned to the gallery, voice still even, passion held inside the boundary of duty. This building will correct the record, and the records. The distinction settled everywhere at once. Heavy as truth. Reporters wrote the sentence twice to make sure they kept its shape. Gray lowered his eyes and learned something he should have known already. Outside, the storm leaned into the glass and spoke in unbroken lines. Inside, no one moved, because weight teaches quiet, and the numbers had finally found their witness. Outside, rain answered with unrelenting, measured applause. The courtroom inhaled as Aisha set both hands on the bench. Charts dimmed to a quiet glow. The last slide waited like a witness. She acknowledged the medic's signal, then faced the man whose story had collapsed. Officer Daniel Harper stared at the tabletop, jaw tight, pulse visible at his temple. Rain drummed, then receded to a hush that felt like the building catching breath. Aisha lifted the gavel, waited, and set it down unused, choosing words over wood. This court has weighed sworn testimony, fixed camera recordings, access logs, written reports, and the rules that govern police conduct, she said. The sequence is plain. Contact occurred without lawful cause. The body camera failed during the very interval most essential to accountability, while courthouse lenses recorded what it missed. Sworn statements contradict both the video and the paperwork. Patterns across 15 years reveal bias and opportunism. The gallery stood. Gray looked down at pages that no longer guided him. The clerk held her pen above the ledger, waiting for the line that would mark the turn. Daniel Harper, Aisha said, this court finds you guilty. On the count of assault under color of law, 10 years. On the count of perjury, 5 years. On the count of civil rights violations with aggravating factors, 10 years. These terms run consecutively for a total of 25 years. Credit for time served begins upon remand. Probation is denied, bail is revoked, custody transfers now. The words carried no celebration. They carried structure, and structure finally carried weight. Harper's shoulders folded inward, a tent collapsing around a cold lamp. His lips parted as if one more rehearsed sentence might rescue him. Nothing arrived. Carter studied his boots. Evans watched the wall clock's second-hand circle without mercy. Gray's chin lowered. Mortification gave way to resolve. Reporters wrote quickly, eyes bright from rain and shock rather than sentiment. The gallery stayed composed, benches offering old creaks that sounded like furniture, remembering how to stand for something. Aisha was not finished. She directed the clerk to issue writs, preserving every recording connected to Harper's cases, open or closed. She ordered the department to halt the destruction of camera footage, radio archives, vendor mirrors, and any off-site backups. She compelled internal affairs to deliver complaint files, supervisor audits, and training logs by firm deadline. She referred the matter to the Federal Civil Rights Office and the Inspector General, requesting a full review for pattern or practice violation. She set hearings for petitions from defendants whose cases relied on Harper's untested claims, and announced procedures for synchronized playback sessions, supervised by a neutral technician. Each order moved like a key sliding into a lock. A hush sank deeper. Outside, the storm thinned until fine strands crossed the glass. Light pressed through a gap in the cloud deck and laid soft bars upon the rail. Dust rose and fell inside those pale ladders. A quiet choreography no one disturbed. The clerk stamped copies, each thud a metronome that retimed the building. Jenkins labeled drives, checked seals, and logged another chain entry in block letters. Process, neglected for years, remembered its path. Aisha faced the people who had watched rain, testimony, and data align. Courts are not theaters, she said. They are machines for truth that need maintenance, vigilance, and courage. Accountability is not a headline. It is a habit. Her tone stayed composed, yet the air brightened, like after a long electrical storm. She glanced at the back row where a teenager clutched a damp hoodie and slowly lowered it. The clerk's small smile refused to leave. 2 deputies approached Harper. Jenkins took the holstered sidearm from the rail and passed it into a lockbox. The deputies asked the former witness to rise. He stood slowly, spine wavering, eyes searching for a script that had burned to ash. Cuffs closed with a firm click that traveled along wood and brass. Small yet decisive. He turned once toward the screen where a frozen frame still held scattered papers, and a hand raised without justification. No defiance remained, only a man surrounded by the record he tried to bend. Applause began in a timid scatter, then swelled. It carried gratitude, not glee. It moved from the back row to the bar, from journalist to the clerk who would not clap but could not stop smiling. Gray let it crest and fall, then thanked the gallery for restraint. Outside, the rain finally let up. Sunlight poured through the high windows, drawing warm rectangles across tile, brass, and faces. Aisha raised a palm, and the room settled. Ever dream of a day when justice truly speaks? Aisha made it happen. The line arrived as a bridge, not a slogan. It crossed from one officer's misconduct to a task that belongs to the city. The work continues, she added. We will audit, we will correct, we will earn trust by proving worthy of it, one file at a time. Faces softened across the rows as people realized they were not watching a spectacle but a repair. The rebuilding of something they had feared was gone. She directed the clerk to post notices about public access to non-confidential recordings under the statute. She set a calendar for status checks on preservation, audits, and the Federal Review. She tasked Jenkins with coordinating the neutral technicians' sessions open to counsel, with same-day transcripts. She asked Gray to join her in drafting administrative guidance that would close the gaps those empty audit columns had exposed, and to retrain supervisors on randomized footage review. The deputies led Harper down the aisle, boots thudded without swagger. He passed within an arm's length of the plaque outside the door, the one that had spoken plainly in brass all along. He did not look at it. He watched the floor as if the tile might soften the consequence. When the door closed behind him, the sound felt final because the process secured it, not because the spectacle demanded it. Outside, clouds broke, pavement steamed. Sirens in the distance resolved into ordinary traffic. The plaza filled with people who had waited under awnings and now spoke in complete sentences rather than rumors. The courthouse exhaled. Aisha signed the last order in the day's set and rested the pen upon the blotter. Reporters approached with questions and received only what the record allowed. She did not narrate herself. She offered decisions, times, documents, paths for petitions, and the names of offices now engaged. Calm dignity replaced any impulse toward victory. This had never been about winning. It was about aligning duty with evidence until they became indistinguishable. Inside, the clerks stacked stamped packets, added tabs and labeled folders with dates that would anchor future remedies. Jenkins locked the cabinet and placed the key in the safe, process reserved for days that change a courthouse. Gray stood aside, absorbing the hum of work properly done. Benches stood empty, yet their old boards seemed lighter, as if they too had set something down. Aisha looked over the room and rose. She did not bow or wave. She simply breathed, and the building matched the rhythm. Outside, sunlight climbed the steps, found the brass letters and brightened them until every passerby could read what should never have been doubted. Judgment spoke in her voice, yet belonged to the law. The doors opened. The city received its echo. The courthouse still trembled with echoes of applause when Aisha leaned forward, robe draped across her shoulders, eyes steady on the room that had carried both deception and truth. The deputies had already led Harper away in chains, his 25-year sentence marking not just the end of his career, but the beginning of something larger. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the clerk's pen began again, quiet but certain, like a heartbeat returning after a crisis. The aftermath begins. Harper's imprisonment sent a shockwave through the department. Officers who once stood shoulder to shoulder with him now faced questions about their own records. Supervisors scrambled to review cases that had been rubber-stamped for years. Complaints buried under not sustained labels resurfaced under federal review. Civil attorneys filed motions to reopen convictions, their evidence now bolstered by Aisha's orders. Trust, once shattered, began to find threads to mend. Systemic reform in motion. The department announced sweeping reforms. Every patrol unit was outfitted with mandatory body cameras. No exceptions, no excuses. Supervisors were required to audit random footage weekly. Their signatures were tied to new accountability laws. A civilian oversight board, drawn from clergy, educators, and neighborhood leaders, gained full authority to review misconduct files and publish findings publicly. Training modules were rewritten to emphasize de-escalation and bias awareness, tracked by completion logs and independent evaluators. The system bent beneath Aisha's ruling but did not break. It reshaped, compelled by evidence rather than promises. National recognition of Aisha. News outlets across the country carried her image. A calm face framed by the heavy black robe, voice captured in clear soundbites. This court will correct the record and the records, she had said, and the line was repeated on front pages and nightly broadcasts. Law schools invited her to speak. Civil rights organizations hailed her as a symbol of integrity in a time when skepticism was easy and trust rare. Students painted murals of her likeness, gavel in hand, beneath the caption, "Justice wears robes." The courthouse renamed. Weeks later, crowds gathered on the plaza for a dedication ceremony. Rain threatened but never fell. The old plaque was lowered, its letters dulled by years of weather, and a new one gleamed in sunlight. The Honorable Aisha R. Thompson, Courthouse. Here justice found its voice. Applause rolled across the steps as people touched the metal, some in reverence, some in relief. Inside, portraits of past judges remained, but hers was placed first in the line, not last. A reminder that truth does not wait at the end, but must lead from the beginning. Community healing. Neighborhood forums began to hum with cautious optimism. Residents who once avoided reporting misconduct now file complaints with confidence that their records will not vanish. The Oversight Board opened its first public hearing, streamed online for anyone to watch. Transparency became routine rather than revolution. Youth programs that had once lost funding regained it, tied now to the idea that safety required trust, not fear. The city, long used to headlines of despair, began to see itself differently, not healed but healing. The subtle call, "Ever dream of a day when justice truly speaks?" The voiceover asked in broadcasts, replaying Aisha's verdict. Aisha made it happen. It was not a slogan. It was a question that lived in living rooms, in classrooms, in conversations whispered across fences. People asked themselves what role they might play in keeping the voice of justice alive. An urgent invitation. Now it is your turn. Share Aisha's story if you believe no one is above the law. Share it if you know that truth can be silenced only if we allow it. Share it so others may find the courage to demand accountability where silence once lived. Like this story if you stand for justice, because clicks and shares become signals, and signals become movement. Subscribe for more stories of courage, because voices like Aisha's do not appear by chance. They emerge from communities that refuse to let fear dictate their future. The universal message: her courtroom has become more than a building. It is a symbol of what happens when silence breaks, when lies unravel, and when one person refuses to bow to the weight of false authority. The name on the plaque is hers, but the echo belongs to everyone who believes law should serve truth. Remember this each time you walk past a courthouse, each time you read a headline, each time you question whether accountability is possible. Justice does not wear armor. Justice does not carry banners. Justice wears robes. And when spoken with courage, justice wears your voice too.